um, the health issues and things for becoming dehydrated. Just quickly review how that dehydration is going to occur. Most commonly, it's going to occur when you are sweating heavily, if you're exercising in the heat, and the water is going to come from the inter and extracellular compartments, including from your blood plasma, from muscle tissue and skin, and from your internal organs, and even some from your bone, although your brain is very good at maintaining its fluid levels under sweating conditions. All right? You're going to be more susceptible to becoming dehydrated given certain environmental factors that we'll cover after the next exam. All right? So that's really an interesting chapter because where we live, we hit many of these environmental challenges to exercise. So that's fun. Weight class sports. So people who take part in weight class sports are susceptible because they tend to do silly things like put on rubber suits and sit in the sauna to try to make their weight for their level. Protective equipment, so we mentioned earlier this week about the fact that football players are particularly at risk, cricketers, because of the amount of padding and extra protection that they wear when they're competing, and they're typically competing outside, so that puts them at more risk. Wearing dark-colored clothing or dark-colored equipment can be a problem. If you've been ill, so if you've had a fever or if you've had diarrhea and you haven't managed to maintain your hydration status, then that can be a problem. And sadly, just getting older puts you at more risk for dehydration because your thirst sensitivity goes down. So you don't get that thirst mechanism, even though we said the thirst mechanism kicks in late. It's even worse as you get older because you don't kind of recognize it as well. And the older you get, the harder it becomes to maintain your blood plasma volume as well. So those two things put the older population at more risk. Okay, so this diagram, I'm going to turn the light down so we can actually see it, is in the textbook, but I just want to go over and point out a couple of items for you because I think it's a really useful summary of what happens if I'm trying to do aerobic work and I'm becoming dehydrated or I am dehydrated. All right? So, problem turning the light off, of course, is now I can't read my notes. So we've got three main kind of issues occurring that impact that aerobic idea. The first one is regarding what's happening with the cardiovascular system. All right? So if I'm sweating a lot, then my blood plasma volume goes down. And that leads to a decrease in stroke volume because there's less volume of blood, right? A decrease in stroke volume means that in an attempt to try to maintain cardiac output, we see an increase in heart rate, and eventually, if you don't address the situation, you'll see a decrease in cardiac output, and then your muscles aren't getting enough glucose and enough oxygen, and so they can't maintain aerobic metabolism effectively. So the heart rate goes up 3 to 5 beats for every 1% dehydration that you're indicating. All right, so if you remember Wednesday, I think I mentioned that heart rate was a really good way of identifying if you are dehydrated, and we also used it for the overtraining idea, right? So sometimes my heart rate's going to go up because I'm overtraining, sometimes it's going up because I'm dehydrated. Okay?
You said 3 to 5 beats per minute.
3 to 5 beats per 1% dehydration. Then another area where we see significant problems that impact aerobic work is in the body's ability to thermoregulate, so to maintain its core temperature correctly. All right? So gradually, the more dehydrated I become, then we start to see increases in core temperature, which is called hypothermia. Okay? And once we start to show the symptoms of hypothermia, then sweat rate goes down, which sweating mechanism is a cooling mechanism. So the lower my sweat rate, the less able I am to maintain a cooling situation, which then feeds back into increasing core temperature and making the hypothermia work. So it becomes cyclical. Same here, we see a decrease in skin blood flow. And again, the reason we get all rosy and red when it's hot is that the body diverts blood flow to the skin to try to get heat release. So again, moving blood away from the skin means that I'm not able to release so much heat, and again feeds back into increase in the core temperature. So once that cycle has started, it's hard to break without stopping and drinking and taking good care of yourself. Okay. And then the third element is the actual metabolic work, the metabolism that's going on. All right? So we'll see a decrease in VO2 max and earlier fatigue because we start to use glycolysis rather than aerobic metabolism, and that then we've got hydrogen and lactate and causing acidic environment, and so we hit a fatigue kind of slide, really, because we're not able to maintain our aerobic metabolism, and so we start to fatigue much more quickly. Right? So some examples of the kind of decrease in performance that you might see that the textbook gives you are that for middle long distance track races, if you have a 2% body mass dehydration, then you see a decline in a 5K race of about 5%, and in a 10K race about 3%. So that's quite a significant drop in performance at that level. They've also looked at rowers because that's a highly cardiovascular activity, competitive rowing. And rowers in a 2K, they were looking at, they had dehydrated them to 5%, so that's pretty dramatic for aerobic work. And they saw a 22-second drop in their 2K performance. So that's huge, you know. Sometimes in a really tight rowing race, it's like that much of the boat in front of the other boat, you know. So a 22-second drop in performance is really massive. Okay? So if we are trying to do aerobic work and we're dehydrated, then you're likely to see or feel that you're working much harder. So when they look at RPE so that Borg scale, when they look at the Borg scale for people who are dehydrated, then their perception of how hard they're working is much higher, even though you've got them on the same, you haven't changed anything, right? Cognitive function goes down. So when cognitive function decreases, that can lead to a decrease in motivation. And so then, then that impacts performance and times as well. It also will impact decision making. So you might make a really silly strategic decision that means that you lose the game or something, or worse, you might make a movement error that causes an injury, right? So about 2 to 3% then we see a drop in aerobic power. Interestingly, when we look at cold climates versus hot climates in chapter 11, the impact of dehydration when you are exercising in a cold climate is less than it is when you're exercising in a hot climate. And so that suggests that of these three kind of areas, thermoregulation is the one that is having the biggest problem and the biggest impact on the aerobic ability, right? So what about anaerobic work? It's not quite the same picture when we look at anaerobic. There's, for starters, the research on anaerobic work when you're dehydrated is a lot more inconsistent. So the results don't all line up quite as nicely as they do with the aerobic work. There's a much bigger window for dehydration with anaerobic work than there is for aerobic work, although eventually increased dehydration does lead to an increased decline in performance. But as I said, the window is quite a bit bigger, so we've only got 2% before we see some serious drop in performance for aerobic work. When we look at anaerobic work, it takes 3 to 4% before we see a drop in muscular endurance activities, and probably about the same level for muscular power activities like jumping. When we look at strength events, it's actually 5 or more % before we see a really significant drop in strength. So, quite a lot more wiggle room if you're an anaerobic than if you're an aerobic athlete. Okay. So, probably because of the fact that the big problem with dehydration is the drop in plasma volume, and then that impacts cardiac output. Well, of course, when we're doing anaerobic work, that's not a problem because I'm not needing oxygen in the cell to make my ATP if I'm doing an anaerobic activity. So the biggest issue with dehydration physiologically doesn't impact anaerobic work, especially if it's very short duration. So, high intensity that's lasting 30 to 120 seconds, once we get into glycolysis, then we see some drop, but as I say, the dehydration has to be much higher. it does seem like if you're working anaerobically in a hot environment, you're more likely to see a decline in performance than if you're working indoors in a controlled environment. So that probably ties back to the idea of thermoregulation again. And oddly, research would suggest that if you're in a strength event, that you're more likely to see a drop in strength performance in upper body activities than in lower body activities. But I can't come up with a reason why that might be. The book doesn't tell us the why, it just says the research says this. And so I don't know what might be the underlying variables that would make the upper body more susceptible than the lower body. So much less effective than aerobic work, but it can still be significant if the dehydration is bad enough. Okay? So let's get to the application stuff. If I'm a coach or teacher and I've got athletes, PE students, or I've got clients if I'm a trainer, then how can we monitor hydration status in these individuals? So we mentioned on Wednesday the idea of using a scale, right? Weigh yourself nude, exercise, weigh yourself again. You should not change weight. So as long as your weight post-exercise session is within plus or minus 1% of your weight before the session, then you've managed to maintain your hydration status pretty well and you're euhydrated. However, a loss of more than 1% from your pre-exercise weight indicates that you are dehydrated, right? So that's one way we can use our body mass and a scale. Another way is to look at urine color, right? And this might be preferable if you're working with a female team, perhaps, and you don't want to introduce a scale because of the connotation. Once you put a scale down, then they're going to start using it to check their weight every day, and you know the whole kind of body image gets skewed. So another way of doing it is to teach them to use a urine chart, and you can put them up in the locker room so that, you know, put them up on the insides of the toilet stalls and things to help your athletes or your students learn how to monitor their urine. So if you're euhydrated, it should be pretty light. The more dehydrated you get, the darker the urine color will become. Can be skewed by certain supplements, certain vitamins that you might take can skew the color. So you have to keep an eye on that. Try to, you know, match it up with anything that you've taken that day. And if you are good at drinking a lot of fluid after your exercise session, that might skew it with the immediate movement of the water into the body. So there's lots of charts available. If you just type in urine chart to Google, you'll get like 100 or more, okay? I picked this one because I visually like the idea of the red line, because that's the kind of, you've passed the safe level now. So if you compare it here, here's my plus or minus 1% means that I've managed to stay well hydrated and I'm euhydrated over my pre-exercise body weight. Then my urine color, if I've managed to maintain that, should be around here. Right? Minimal dehydration, then numbers 3 and 4. Not all the different versions of the chart have that red line to split the fact that once you're in 4, although you're still only slightly dehydrated, you're heading in the wrong direction, right? And then we get darker and darker and darker, and once you're kind of here, then you're really in trouble, right? So, if you've had a stomach upset and you've been vomiting a lot and you haven't been able to keep any fluids down, then likely to end up in this area, right? If you're just not drinking enough and you're not sick and you end up here, then that's pretty silly. And you just got to drink more, right? You shouldn't be allowing yourself to get into this situation if you're not ill. Okay. But as I said, there's many, many different versions of this, and you can just like hand them out to your athletes, put them up in the locker room, put them up in your PE classroom. Right? I've said a couple of times, the more autonomy you give to your students, your clients, your athletes, the more you teach them to take care of themselves, the better off you are, because people don't respond well to being told to do things. It's much better if they can monitor themselves and they go, oh, I need to drink more. Then you stand in front of the team going, did you drink a bottle of water before you came to training? You know, they're all going to go, uh-huh, whether they did or not, right? So, it's, there's lots of useful tools out there to help out. So typically when we're talking about fluids, the problem is dehydration. But it is also possible, although relatively rare, to go the other way on the continuum. And you can develop a problem that is due to low blood sodium concentration because you drink too much water. And that's called hyponatremia, or water intoxication. So particularly, again, long distance events, Tour de France cyclists have had problems developing hyponatremia because they're on the road cycling for 4 hours or longer, and they just keep drinking, and if there wasn't enough sodium, if they're only drinking water, then they can develop a problem. So one of the reasons for adding sodium to the sports drinks is to try to alleviate the problem of hyponatremia. Okay? What happens when you have this problem is that because of the sodium concentration changing, the osmotic pressure, the osmotic balance across the membranes goes out of whack, and so we see fluid moving out of the bloodstream and out of the extracellular compartments into the brain tissue. That causes swelling of the brain, and there's no room inside your skull for your brain to swell, right? So then it's pushing up against the inside of your skull, and the swelling can lead to you becoming disoriented, confusion. You could see someone have a seizure. Depending on how bad the seizure is, they can drop into a coma, and you can die. So it's very serious. It's just relatively rare. There was an odd case I can't even remember if it was while I was in Auburn or since I've been in New Mexico. But there's, you have those long kind of glass, it's like a drink race, a drink competition. Anybody know what I'm talking about? They have these long, there's no pens today. They're kind of like, and it's like a competition to drink the beer as fast as you can. Well, they had it on a radio station, and some young lady was in the competition. Well, a female can't drink as much fluid as a big guy can, and she passed out and ended up in the hospital. Right? So, mostly it's athletes, mostly it's long distance athletes. But as I said, it can be a problem, especially if you say to your client, oh, it's really hot, make sure you drink plenty of water when you're exercising, and then they go completely berserk and drink too much water. So, you know, always kind of qualify your statements and say, take a couple of glugs every 15 to 20 minutes. You don't need to be chucking down a whole liter every 20 minutes, right? It can be caused by excessive sodium loss in sweat. So again, if you're using a sport drink that has sodium, that helps. There's also some information that it might not always be linked to drinking too much water, but there's a problem with moving the sodium stores around in the body that causes the problem. So instead of putting more sodium into the blood, for some reason it's getting held back at the kidneys or something like that, right? So there are some other mechanisms other than just drinking too much water, but that's the most common version of it. Does seem to be if women are taking part in ultra marathons or triathlon, you know, those kind of really crazy long distance races, then there seems to be an indication that women are at more risk than men, although they don't really understand why that would happen more than the men. So it's not fully understood. I'm sure it has something to do with the fact that the women are smaller and maybe they're drinking the same amount as their male counterpart on the team. I'm not sure. But so what this kind of points to is that it's really important that we develop individual hydration plans, that you don't just say to everybody a blanket amount of water to drink, right? So we try, as much as possible, can we develop individual hydration plans? So the guidelines for staying healthy are that you should begin your physical activity fully hydrated. You should be euhydrated when you start, right? So you should not be starting your exercise or your training session feeling thirsty, that you're already on a loser there. Okay? Then you've got to find what works for you for maintaining hydration so that you're within that plus or minus 1% of your weight before you started the training. Step 3 is to make sure that you rehydrate after the activity. So, if you've gone above your 1%, then make sure that you drink regularly for a period of time afterwards to try to rehydrate as quickly as possible. You want the fluid to be palatable, so it's one of the instances where you might want to drink a fruit-flavored water. Check them though, because a lot of those, like the ice, very attractive bottle, lots of nice information, it's full of sugar, that stuff. Right? So you want to find a fruit-flavored water or something that isn't full of sugar or hydrogenated corn syrup, right? You want it to be cool, but not necessarily freezing, okay? So you don't necessarily need ice cubes if you've kept your water in the fridge and it's cool, or at least in the shade and it's cool, right? And if necessary, if you're going to be working out and it's really hot, you want some electrolytes in there. You can buy little powder. I use one that's just at Walmart, that's kiwi and strawberry, and it's just a little phial of powder, and add it to the water and shake it up. It's got no calories per se, but it's got electrolytes in it. So in the summer when it's really hot and we're going to be going hiking or biking for more than 45-50 minutes, then I make sure to have a couple of those packets with me in case I need them, because they're little and they're light. But I mean, you can use other strategies. Some information to help with making hydration plans kind of depends which authority you go to. It's slightly different, but they all come back to this step 1, step 2, step 3 idea, right? Table 10.3, you've got guidelines from the ACSM and the NATA. And then box 10.5 is some answers to questions that students have had about how do I manage this. So, as I said, they really all come back to this idea. They just maybe take a slightly different timeline or amount to achieve it. As much as possible individualized. That's why I think using the urine color chart is useful, because if you've got 150 football players, you can say, I want you all to walk around with a jug and you've got to drink a jug. But that's going to be too much for some people and not enough for other people, right? So if you say to them, I want you to start with the idea of a drug, here's the urine chart, drink as much of the jug as you need, or more than the jug if you need, to maintain color 1, 2, and 3. Then you haven't had to individualize 150 hydration plans. You give them the power to individualize for themselves, right? And obviously, When it's cold, we don't need to drink as much as when it's warm. In order to stay hydrated, we don't sweat as much. Okay? So, and when we talk about conditions, again, when we get to that next chapter, we'll look at the difference between a dry climate versus a humid climate. It's quite dramatically different how your body responds and your cooling capabilities. Okay? So that can impact as well. And I think, my friends, that's all I have for you. Ta-da! So, speaking of staying hydrated, it is going to be in the 80s and sunny and not very windy apparently this weekend. So get outside, enjoy being out, but stay hydrated. Use your sunscreen. I don't want to see any pink noses on Monday. And you guys.